we are moving on to steroid hormones. So this diagram shows the synthesis pathway for steroid hormones. And notice that all steroid hormones are synthesized from cholesterol. And the blank boxes represent intermediate compounds that we're omitting here for simplicity. And each step in this pathway is catalyzed by an enzyme, even though only 2 enzymes are shown in a figure for simplicity purposes as well. And so once again, steroid hormones are derived from the lipid cholesterol. Okay, for example, reproductive hormones, testosterone and estrogen, okay, which are produced by the gonads, testes in men, ovaries in women, are examples of steroid hormones. And we also have our adrenal glands, which produce the steroid hormone called aldosterone, which is involved in osmoregulation or regulation of the concentration of salts in our blood. And then we also have cortisol, which the stress hormone, which plays an important role in metabolism. Okay. So consider a case here with a baby born with genetic mutation that results in the deficiency of this 21-hydroxylase enzyme. So based on the role of this enzyme in this pathway illustrated, what would you expect this baby's enzyme, what would you expect to be the levels of these hormones in this baby's body? Okay, so take a moment to consider that. The level of the aldosterone, the level of cortisol, the level of these sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen. Okay. Okay, so 21-hydroxylase deficiency. This is an actual disease that you will encounter when you enter into the next step in your graduate program. Okay, so in this case, a deficiency or absence of 21-hydroxylase should mean that there is going to be a decrease in the production of aldosterone and cortisol. So this baby will exhibit symptoms that reflect low aldosterone and low cortisol level. But because those elevated precursor that have accumulated from not being able to convert to aldosterone cortisol is now shunted toward making up sex hormones. This baby will have increased level of sex hormones, okay, and symptoms that reflect the increased level of sex hormones. So steroid hormones, like cholesterol, they are not soluble in water, meaning they are hydrophobic. And because blood is water-based, lipid-derived hormones must travel to their target cells bound to a transport protein. And this more complex structure extends the half-life of steroid hormones much longer than that of hormones derived from amino acids. So half-life, the half-life of a hormone is the time required for half the concentration of the hormone to be degraded. And as an example, if we look at the half-life of the lipid-derived hormone cortisol, cortisol has a half-life of about an hour to an hour and a half. Okay. In contrast to that, epinephrine, which is an amino acid-derived hormone, only has the half-life of about 1 minute. Okay, so again, shorter half-life, meaning it gets degraded faster and the level drops faster in the blood. And so its effect generally will last a lot shorter. Okay, steroid hormones are lipophilic or hydrophobic, meaning they can freely diffuse across plasma membrane of a cell. And so they typically bind to receptors either inside the cytoplasm or nucleus of the target cell, to form an active receptor hormone complex. And this activated complex will move into a nucleus and bind directly to DNA, where it can serve as a transcription factor for gene expression. And so examples of steroid hormones include those produced by the gonads, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, but also the few we mentioned on the previous slide, aldosterone, as well as the cortisol. Let's now take a closer look at how hormones are transported in blood. So hormones in blood often are associated with binding proteins, and that helps to enhance their solubility to protect them from being degraded and from renal excretion, as well as it helps with regulating their stability in that extracellular space. So as we previously mentioned, receptor location is going to vary with the hormone type. And this image, again, illustrates that same concept. Notice that even though the fat-soluble hormones can freely cross cell membrane, but it must bind to a carrier protein during its transport. So in this image, the hydrophilic or water-soluble hormones are the amine peptide protein hormones. Okay, and these oftentimes can travel in blood without having to bind to a carrier protein. That is, they can travel freely, okay, although they cannot cross cell membrane freely. On the right, we've got hydrophobic or lipid-soluble, fat-soluble hormones, namely the steroids and as well as thyroid hormone. And these hormones, even though they can freely cross the cell membrane, okay, however, when they are traveling or being transported in blood, in order for them to dissolve in blood, they need to bind to a carrier protein. And the level of hormones is determined by its rate of secretion, so how fast it's being secreted, as well as its circulating half-life. Okay, and that's directly related to how fast it's being degraded and excreted. Okay, so hormones released into circulation can circulate either freely or bound to carrier protein, also known as binding proteins. And those binding proteins serve as a reservoir for the hormone and helps prolong the hormone's half-life. Okay, and recall that half-life is the time during which the concentration of a hormone decreases to 50% of its initial concentration. Okay, so a shorter half-life means that hormone is degraded faster in the blood. Okay, and the free or unbound hormone is generally the active form of the hormone, okay, which can bind to a specific hormone receptor. And so therefore, hormone binding to its carrier protein is going to serve to regulate the activity of the hormone by determining how much hormone is free to exert a biologic function. Okay, so most carrier proteins are globulins, and most of those are synthesized in the liver. And some of the binding proteins are specific for a given hormone. For example, we've got cortisol binding protein that binds to cortisol, thyroid binding protein that binds to thyroid hormone, androgen binding protein that bind to the androgens. And because most of these proteins, binding proteins, are synthesized by your liver, so persons with hepatic dysfunction, the people with impaired liver function, may manifest with abnormalities in their binding proteins, and therefore that may indirectly affect the total hormone level in your blood. So whether it's cortisol, right, androgens, sex hormones, or other hormones, especially the fat soluble hormones. Okay. Let's take a look at this question. A newly developed pesticide has been observed to bind to an intracellular hormone receptor. If ingested, residue from this pesticide could disrupt levels of which of these following hormones? Give you a moment to decide, or you can pause this video. So the answer is B, thyroid hormone. Okay, think about why. Okay, of all these hormones, this is the one that can freely cross cell membrane. It's a fat soluble hormone that can freely cross membrane to bind to intracellular receptor. Okay. Okay. So here is just a summary table of what we just discussed. So take a moment to pause this video to review these information. We're moving on to talking about hormone receptors and signal transduction. And this section of the lecture ties in with concepts we've already discussed in the previous, one of the previous lectures. So it'll be pretty brief. Now, cell membrane receptors, receptor classification. So in general, this is a recap of what we discussed earlier in this class. Cell membrane receptors, generally peptides, catecholamines, the amine hormones, peptide hormones, protein hormones, those that are hydrophilic cannot cross cell membrane freely. And so they must bind to cell membrane receptors. Okay. Thyroid hormones, they are not steroid. However, they are lipid soluble. They are poorly soluble in water, so they must bind to carrier proteins during its transport. It's derived from tyrosine, if you recall, and are transported into the cell where it then binds to nuclear receptors. So receptors within the nucleus. Okay. Steroid hormones are lipid soluble. They can freely cross the plasma membrane and bind to intracellular receptors, but sometimes they may also bind to membrane associated receptors, so membrane receptors. Here's a review question for you. A small molecule, aka hormone, binds to a G protein, preventing its activation. What direct effect would this have on signaling that involves cyclic AMP? So take a moment to pause this video and think through this question. Are you ready for the answer? The answer is B. Okay. So if you didn't get this question correctly, please review notes from previous lecture. Lastly, we're going to talk about hormone receptor regulation. So you will recall that target cells must have receptors specific to a given hormone if that hormone is to trigger a response. But several other factors may also influence the target cell response. For example, the presence of a significant level of hormone circulating in the blood can cause its target cells to decrease their number of receptors for that hormone. So this process is down, and it allows cells to become less reactive to the excessive hormone levels. And likewise, when the level of hormone is chronically reduced, the heart cells can engage in upregulation in order to increase their number of receptors. And this process allows the cells to be more sensitive to the hormone that is present. Okay. Cells can sometimes also alter the sensitivity of the receptor themselves to various hormones. And we have a final review question. A student is in a car accident, and although not hurt, immediately experiences pupil dilation, increased heart rate, and rapid breathing. What type of endocrine system stimulus did the student receive? Take a moment to pause this video and think through this question. The answer is C. Okay, so how you should be thinking through this question is first recognizing that these are symptoms of the fight or flight response, right? And fight or flight response is carried out through the autonomic nervous system. And how does that system work, right? We've got stimulation of the adrenal medulla by neurons, okay? Neurons stimulating adrenal medulla, causing its secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, so therefore it's a neural stimulus. And that concludes this lecture.